Welcome to the True You podcast. You may have noticed this is the first episode, or maybe it's not. Oh, I'm taking that back. One of the first episodes where you don't hear a whole lot of pre-recorded messaging that Marty and I recorded when we first started doing the True You podcast about, by now, maybe 15 episodes ago. It just occurred to me, and then I've discussed it with Marty here today. We don't really need you to hear the same thing over and over and over again that we say at the beginning of every different session. So we're just going to jump right in to whatever it is that we're going to be talking about. And for now, since we don't have any guests scheduled for in the near future, Marty and I are just going to pick whatever topics are hot for us right now. And Marty, you sent me an email. This is Dr. Martin Kettlehut. He's my co-host here on the True You podcast. And I'm Bill Tierney, certified IFS practitioner and results coach. You sent me an email this morning and had a proposal for today's conversation. We've been talking about it. And I said, we better hit record or I'm going to run out of time here. So here we are. You want to talk about your ideas?
Well, I'm interested in, because I'm reading a couple of things right now that are very visionary. Buckminster Fuller, guiding spaceship Earth. I don't know if people are familiar with him anymore. But he's a brilliant mind, thinking way ahead of a lot of us. He died, I think, in the early 80s. And then I'm also rereading Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth, which is not a brand new book either. But both men, and they're not alone, have a vision of humanity really waking up, right? From I'm going to call it a parts-led society, but by parts-led individuals. And so I started thinking, how does that happen? Like, how does that come to be? Do we each have to work on ourselves and then find each other and sort of, synthesize a greater self to be led by? Or is there some way that, we could do it en masse or collectively? Sure. I can't imagine it working from the top down. Like, we got a benevolent dictator who said, okay, everybody's got to do parts work now. I don't think that.
Right.
It's so I'm interested in how, this top-down approach that we want to our lives, self-led lives, it seems like to have a world that works that way, it's going to come from the bottom up. And how does that happen? So that was the question that drove me to write you this morning.
Yeah. And our conversation meandered before we hit record and went to, the identification of several people who have the power at least in the Western world here. Those people that have the power also have a ton of money.
Or another kind of power. Like we also talked about, self-led people like the Buddha, right? Or Jesus Christ, or more recently, people like Eckhart Tolle, right? So, but like you mentioned Bill Gates and how his is a more self-led business than a Zuckerberg's. Zuckerberg's is a parts-led business for sure, and so that's sort of an in-between size entity. It's not the collective of all humanity, but it is more of a collective than one individual. It's a big company.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So before we get much further, I think the language is being used here that not every listener understands. I don't want to just assume people know what you mean by top-down, bottom-down, self-led, parts-led, and the difference between a self-led business and a parts-led business. So do you mind? Let's just slow it down and talk about what you mean by all those things.
Okay. This is the problem with my writing too, by the way. It all occurs to me at once. Like I'm not a linear left brain thinker. I'm a sort of asystematic systems thinker. Like I see the whole system at once and I don't know where to start.
Well, hey, as long as you're willing to slow it down and help us keep up, I don't see a problem.
Great. That's very generous.
Okay. I don't know. Is it generous? I just want to understand. What do you mean by parts led?
Our parts are usually trauma induced, but they represent sort of like a nodal moment in our development where something got stuck in a way that didn't it's still it's still tending to and concern about the same issue that it was when it originally happened in us today. And so that's why we want to tend to it and bring it up to date so that it can be freed of that old duty and we can be led by a deeper sense of self.
Cool. All right. So that's what I thought you meant. And I want to offer a distinction in the language because not all parts are still stuck in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Parts can either be self-led or past-led. Or another way to say that would be self-led or burden-led.
Uh-huh.
So burden-led parts are bringing a perspective and an influence that's burdened by unresolved past events.
Yes.
And as you say, they're organized around those past events, still trying to solve them, still looking for evidence that they may happen again. And in the case of manager parts, working very hard to make sure that doesn't happen anymore. And in the case of firefighter parts, reacting when it does. So, yeah. So if we go back to the idea of a parts-led business or a self-led business, I think what you're saying and the way it lands and the way I understand it is there are businesses that are being led by people who are mostly influenced by burden parts.
Yes.
That are trying to solve the past by, let's say, for example, accumulating money and doing better than their competitors and so on and so forth.
Yeah. And not only that, but they've got everybody in the company. There are millions of people that work for these people we have in mind. So it's not just one person. He's got everybody's parts triggered.
Absolutely. Right. Most good, successful, profitable businesses have a vision that guides, a vision and a mission that guides what everybody does in the organization so that that vision can be realized. Right. And if the vision is self-led, then you're going to have a self-led company. Mm-hmm. Or you have a chance at having a self-led company. But if the vision is designed around strategies to solve the past, in other words, if it's a burdened parts-led vision that runs the company, then absolutely, how can you have anything other than a burdened parts-led company?
Right.
Now we're talking about business here, but your question is bigger than that. I mean, one of the offers you made for today's conversation is the difference between I'll just restate it now, burdened parts-led business to a self-led business. Mm-hmm. And the other one was, what about these examples of people in history, like the Buddha and Eckhart Tolle, who still, of course, is alive, who are self-led? What would it take to get society to be self-led?
Yes.
Thing. So I think we're talking about all of this, and business, of course, especially here in the West, is a huge part of what defines society.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In a capitalist society, it is.
I want to also stay in the vernacular on what we're talking about and what it all means. Self-led, for those that aren't familiar with the internal family systems model, I believe means, well, you tell me, what do you mean by self-led? Or I can do it. You want to do it this time?
Go ahead.
Okay, so my understanding of self with a capital S is that this is the essence of who we are at our core before trauma has occurred, before there's been a problem that has gone unresolved in our lives. That's who we're born as, the essence of who we are, who we were born as, and who we still are, but somehow gets clouded and hidden away because of the unresolved past being taken over by parts of ourselves who volunteer to keep us safe in our lives. and to prevent us from getting hurt again. And so we lose access to that capital S self and all of the nuanced qualities and resources that come from the essence of who we are. So a self-led person is someone who's recovered and restored, or never did lose access to the essence of who they are at their core.
Mm-hmm.
And in the IFS model, capital S self mostly is thought of as somehow a separate entity, from what I understand, a separate energy or entity within a human being, a person that is different and separate from parts. But I don't think of it that way. That's a separate distinction.
You think of it in what way?
I believe that a human being shows up in the material world through parts 100% of the time. And that when self shows up, self is showing up through a self-led part.
Mm-hmm.
And when self is not showing up, it's because burden-led parts are dominating. So self is the potential in every single part of us.
Okay.
Not a separate energy or entity.
So like your essence, as they talk about in ontological coaching, is that a part that's self-led?
Yeah, my essence is that the predominance of whatever parts are providing my perspective and the most dominant influence on who I show up as in the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I like that so much just because if I'm suffering, if I'm getting tripped up, if I'm stuck, if I'm out of regulation, as we would talk about if it was a therapy conversation, then 100% of the time in my experience, it's because there's a part, a burden part that's gotten activated by something that's happening in my life right now that's got it scared and reacting.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can slow it down, spend time with that activated burden part, then I can come back into self-guidance, self-energy, self-leadership.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In other words, the self of all those parts, including the one that got activated in the first place, begins to emerge again.
This is interesting. We've never quite talked about this way. And I can see how we've had some guests who think the former and some guests who think the latter.
Yes.
As practitioners of IFS, that raises a question for me. What holds all of these parts together, or are they not held together? If we're only made of parts, then what's the self?
It's an aspect of a part. It's the core essence of a part. And I, Bill Tierney, am made up of parts. Mm-hmm. Every single one of them at its core and essence has a self energy and the resources that and qualities that accompany that. Mm-hmm. That's the core of who I am. Mm-hmm. I am, well, and as Richard Swartz might say, I am greater than the sum of my parts, but that's who I am.
That's what I'm interested in, is the you that's greater than the sum of the parts.
Yeah, when those parts are balanced and in harmony, greatness beyond their individual addition shows up.
So, but what possesses that greatness?
That unifying self-energy.
Oh, so there is a unified self-energy.
It's shared. Yeah. If I'm let's just say I'm one of my parts. This is, by the way, this isn't science and this isn't especially the truth. I don't know. It's my theory, I guess. But the way I understand it is that let's just say that I, who's presenting to you right now, am one of Bill Tierney's parts. Mm-hmm. If you wanted to have a conversation with me as one of Bill Tierney's parts, I would tell you, oh yeah, I've got self in me. And other parts of Bill have self in them as well. Mm-hmm. And the self in those other parts is just like the self in me. Mine's a little bit nuanced because I, as a part of Bill, have a like you might say, a personality and specialization. I'm the part of Bill that really loves to keep him organized. Let's say mm-hmm. I'm that part of him. Mm-hmm. And so given that my interest and specialty is to keep Bill organized, the self in me helps me accomplish that. Whereas the part over here that used to like to help Bill write music, it's been kind of dormant lately, but if it were to wake up again and get active, it would use itself to specialize in creativity, like finding lyrics and music that goes to get, sounds that go together in a pleasant way.
It sounds like there's an analogy there between, well, it could be a company or a country, and everybody who is a citizen of that country. All those parts of the country are Americans.
Yes.
And then there's that unified sense of what America is too.
Yeah.
Right. But so I guess I want to ask, is that a good analogy? And if so, then what is America? What is the self?
What is the self of America? Is that what you're asking?
No. Like we could say, well, all of those parts of America, all the individual people that make up America,
citizens of the United States,
right?
Okay.
What is it that they have in common? And we would point to citizenship and adherence to what that means. Abiding.
An agreement that the Constitution is a guiding principle for being a citizen.
For example, exactly right. Centrally that, yes. And so then going back to the individual, then what is that we would point to that constitutes the self of all these parts that Bill's made of?
I want to go back to the specialization of each individual. Like I like to think that, and now I'm not speaking as one of Bill's parts anymore. I'm speaking as Bill. I like to think that the unified and harmonious, balanced contribution of all of my self-led parts produce a result, which is clarity about my purpose. What am I here for? And the way I have distinguished that,
like the Constitution does for Americans,
yes, is that it makes sense to me. It rings true for me. It inspires me. It motivates me. Whatever that, it feels true, and I feel called forth by it. That's how I know it feels good. I used to play a game. I may have mentioned this in another episode before, but I used to play a game when I was growing up with my brother and 5 sisters, where one of us would hide something. And then that person would stand in the center of wherever we're playing, and then give instruction to the other 5 people whose job it was to try to find the object. And the person that hid the object would give clues. Two clues: warmer or hotter.
Yeah, we played that.
Colder or hotter.
We played that game too.
Yeah. Okay. So it seems like it works that way inside too. Like colder feels better. Warmer feels better.
Yeah. Like this is me. This is hitting the spot. I like this.
Right. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
This is fulfilling my purpose.
Yes.
Ultimately, I guess.
I was talking just this morning about how so many of my parts just hated going to Business Network International, BNI, which was a business networking group that I put together here in Spokane, Washington, starting in about 2002, along with a couple of other business people. And we eventually grew to the largest group in the entire Eastern Washington. But I always hated the idea of going. There were the parts of me just didn't like the idea of networking, shaking hands, meeting new people, trying to sell myself, trying to get them to refer people to me. Just something about it just felt slimy and sleazy, and I just didn't like it. And
I hated it too.
So the night before our Wednesday morning meeting, if I were going to do well, if I was going to get a return on the investment of my time and money for being there, I had to pay to be a member. Essentially, I was investing 3 hours a week in this venture. If it was going to make any business sense at all, I needed to get a return on investment, and that meant whether I liked it or not, I should prepare the night before to go to the meeting the next day, so that when I talked about the services that I offered, people would be inspired and think of people they could send me. If I didn't prepare, there wasn't much of a chance of that happening.
Yeah.
And if all I did was dread it, make myself go and expect to get results, I was going to be really disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
So on the Tuesday nights that I did prepare, and then on Wednesday mornings, I did better. But here's what was universally true, whether I prepared or not, is that when I showed up on Wednesday morning, within 10 minutes, I was connected to people and loving it.
Mm-hmm.
I absolutely enjoyed it. Every single meeting I ever went to, once I got over my nervousness and the parts of me that were telling me that I hated it, that I didn't want to go, and that it was a waste of time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Are you in a profession that helps people discover, cultivate, and express their true selves? Are you a coach, a therapist, a spiritual leader, a health professional, scientist, writer, speaker, or other specialist that recognizes the power and value of authenticity? Would you like to be a guest on our podcast? We're looking for guests to bring on the show to expand this exploration of the true you. You'll find a link in the show notes to use to introduce yourself and start that conversation. Even so much so that even if I didn't get referrals from clients, at the time I was a mortgage lender, even if I didn't get referrals for clients, I felt like it was time well spent because I was getting something of greater value than the money I hoped to get from getting referrals. And that was connection with other people.
So this is helping me understand why I sort of intuitively have these doubts that, and it sounds silly to think that, you could like enforce from the top down that everybody's going to get self-led. Because it sounds like it is the enlightenment of all those people that adds up to a self-led society. Just like all of our parts, as they get updated and freed up and brought on board, that then you could say, well, that individual is being self-led, right?
Right.
So then if we go to the companies here, that it's a collective entity of sorts, of course, if there's one guy at the top running the whole thing, then a lot of shit is going to roll downhill.
Oh, yeah.
But the way that the company itself would come to be self-led would be like if people came together and say, hey, what do you say? Let's lead from love. Let's lead from compassion. Let's lead from wisdom, as opposed to, just trying to make more money than the next guy, or trying to have more power than the next guy, or because of a vendetta or something like that, right?
Yep.
So I would expect then if we look at the difference between, I'm just going to use these two random examples, a Zuckerberg's organization versus a Bill Gates organization, you're going to see Bill and his company, they're more self-led conversations, and they add up to a more self-led company. Whereas Zuckerberg he's inspired selfishness amongst the people. They are all in it for themselves. And so that's why his company is oblivious to our needs as they are.
I would assume that all of that's true. I don't know if it is or not, but I'm
just speculating given the theory that we've laid out.
Exactly. And I just want to point out that maybe Zuckerberg and Meta are not that way. I don't know. But if maybe we're safer to, okay, maybe we should just say company A and company B, rather than.
I don't mind if I'm wrong.
Well, you already know. So this is something that you already know. Okay, so that's fine. Here's where I think we may really benefit in this conversation, and that is to talk about, well, what would it look like? How would we know if it was a self-led company? Mm-hmm. And I want to suggest that the way we would know is we would see manifestation and evidence of the qualities of self showing up.
Right.
And there are, for those that are trained in the IFS model, we refer to the 8 C's and the 5 P's, which are the qualities of self. But I've got a more extensive list than those 8 C's and the 5 P's, and that include all the 8 C's and the 5 P's, but a few other words too that include things like love, integrity, authenticity, transparency, and wisdom. Mm-hmm. What else? And I'll just mention the C's as well. Compassion. If we looked at each one of them, compassion. If a company is self-led, that means that it's going to be a company that's led by and through the perspective of, decisions are made through the perspective of compassion.
Mm-hmm.
Decisions are made, actions are taken, people are hired, disciplined. People are disciplined as employees through the lens of capacity, of compassion. The next word is capacity.
Mm-hmm.
A company that is self-led is probably going to have the capacity to be with people, even that if those people have problems, to serve people, and to have the capacity to serve people, even if it doesn't match, let's just say, a translation into the bottom line being in the black instead of the red.
Mm-hmm.
Curiosity, rather than jumping to conclusions. Oh, this person's lazy. This person didn't show up for work today because they're lazy. Curiosity. I wonder what's happening with Bob. Why isn't he here today? Bob seems like he's been off lately. Oh yeah, he's a shitty employee. Yeah, no. Well, maybe not. Maybe Bob's got something going on. Can we be curious and just be open to finding out? Courage. Maybe this is a company where it's safe enough to be scared. It's safe enough to have courageous conversations.
Right. Or to to allow, because we're talking about people who have platforms, to allow disagreement on your platform. That takes courage.
Yes. Yeah, much different.
It's much easier to just say, if anybody disagrees with me, shoot them. That's
Mhm.
much easier.
Yeah. Certainly not self-led. Sometimes I think that the word self was a bad choice to describe what it is that Dick Schwartz means by the core essence of who we are, capital S, self, because that word self in the lowercase often means just the opposite.
Right.
Yeah. It means what's often referred to as ego,
Right.
or what we now understand in the IFS lens as through the IFS lens as burden-led parts: selfish, self-centered, self-focused, self-driven, self-promoting. Those are all kind of negative criticisms of a person. And now we're going to take the very same word and put a capital S on it and say this is who we really are. Yeah, that's a little confusing.
Mm-hmm.
But so it's easier to look at these other things like, and by the way, each of these other words that describe the qualities of self can be cannibalized and used in a non-self-led way. Like let me pretend to be compassionate. Let me use compassion or what appears to be compassion to get what it is that I want.
I have it, by the way, too.
Yeah.
In the Siddha Yoga spiritual tradition, which comes from Kashmir, it's a Shaivistic tradition, meaning Shiva is the Lord of all consciousness, is what Shiva stands for. There is only the self with a capital S. All of the degenerations of self are called other things, like ego, although they don't use that word, but it's a translation of that word, or the senses, or the sensual self. And like there are, I think, 14 different tattvas, they're called, principles that are less than the self with the capital S, but they don't have that's just your small self. They're because the idea is let's lead with the self. Let's be self.
Mm-hmm.
Capital S. That's it in comparison. I think.
It is. It sounds very aligned, in fact. Yeah. Where my mind's going right now is, so what is it that causes an individual to be more burden-led than self-led?
Mm-hmm.
And this might get a little bit into the conversation, or we might be able to use the conversation around addiction and recovery to address this. So, So, for example, traditional thinking around addiction and recovery is that recovery means that we're no longer, that we've been liberated from the addiction. But what I'm recognizing is that recovery really would mean that we have healed that which required the addiction in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that gets in the way of a self-led individual or a self-led company, is that which addiction is needed to manage. Am I making sense?
I didn't understand the last phrase. Addiction is needed to
manage
manage.
that which we need to recover from.
I see. It's a survival mechanism.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Whether the addiction helps to numb or, pumps up dopamine and serotonins and adrenaline and that sort of thing to have a different internal experience than the one that's otherwise too painful.
Yep. Yep.
So addiction isn't just, so for the longest time in my recovery, starting in 1982, it didn't seem to matter how many times I heard from people in my recovery community, this is not a moral issue. I also heard in even more powerful ways, this is a moral issue.
Yeah.
This is about the reason that you have addiction or ever have had addiction is because of morality, because you lack integrity, because you lie, because you cheat, because you steal, because you are resentful, because you hurt people, because you live in fear, because you don't have a good relationship with God. There's something morally decrepit about you that has you having this addiction. And if you can solve for all of that, then you'll no longer have the addiction.
Wow. Geez, that's horrible. I'm happy to say that the 12-step group that I'm in has never said anything like that.
I'm glad to hear that. Because it can't work. It's just, what I want to acknowledge that, this is maybe others that went through and trudged through this journey with me for the 35 years that I was involved in 12-step may have been sitting in the seat very next to me and had a completely different experience. But this is how I experienced it. It felt like I just extended from my violent alcoholic Catholic family into Alcoholics Anonymous at the age of 27, and all the same rules and principles applied. Could be that somebody else who landed in a seat next to me on the very same day, November 15th, 1982, could have had the very same experience with me and had processed it in a completely different way. They might have seen it as loving and supportive and kind and generous. I felt it as pressure and threat and fear and shame. Like I was doing anything and everything that I could to avoid drinking so that I didn't experience even worse consequences than what drinking was presenting in my life. Mm-hmm. And that's the way I was hearing it. I was surviving in that way. Mm-hmm. But only for 21 years of the first 21 years of my sobriety.
And now we're in which year?
Currently 42.
So self entered about halfway through this time.
Well, it was introduced. I'll say it. Yeah, I was introduced to the experience of the ability to be self-aware. I'll say it that way. In about 22 years. Everything else prior to that time, it was completely externally focused. What's out there that's safe and what's out there that's a threat. The answer, by the way, was most of it's a threat. And very little of it is safe. So let's limit life. Let's be safe. Let's do things right. Let's do things perfectly. Let's perform. And anything that's less than perfect and anything that's less than what I'm proud of that I've performed, I need to hide. I just need to hide all that. Mm-hmm. So no matter what the words of the steps said and say, that was my program. Mm-hmm. Do it right, do it perfectly, hide what isn't right and perfect.
And that's the thing. That's the stuff that drives people to alcohol.
Yes.
Jeez. Oh my gosh.
How did I stay sober?
How did you break free is what I want to know.
Well, it started with Byron Katie. And then once I got Byron Katie, I recognized that the kind of therapy that I was getting was not helpful, because it was talk therapy that the support I was getting was analyzing me and explaining me to me. And I didn't agree. It didn't matter that I didn't agree. So I kind of shit canned that. I stopped that kind of therapy and just went to looking at me.
Just a bracketed observation. We did ask the question a few minutes ago, like, what makes for a self-led person versus somebody who's mostly led by traumatized parts.
Yes.
And it sounds like there's got to be some crack where the sun can get in at some point.
Self-awareness.
Self-awareness has to get in there somehow, because when I look at a lot of people in my life, they're not self-led. I love them, but they're not self-led, and there's been no crack in that. There's no self-awareness.
Well, exactly. That's what I'm saying. And it sounds like you're hearing what I'm saying, is that crack that you're describing is self-awareness. So
Yes.
the question now becomes, how do you begin? Well, how do you begin to have self-awareness?
Right.
I had 15 years before I had my first access to self-awareness. I was sitting in a therapist's office that asked me a question. He said, "Hey, Bill, you ever just kind of sit back and watch yourself and get curious about why you do the things that you do?" Something like that. And I looked at him and I thought, okay, where's the punchline? Are you just messing with me here? What are you talking about? I had no idea what he was talking about. And at that point, I was probably, I guess it must have been a little more than 15 years earlier, because I was 2 years sober.
I have a client like that. He thinks I'm telling like some kind of joke, or just like totally lost. We were discussing Eckhart Tolle, and he's like, "That sounds like a bunch of gobbledygook to me. I don't understand what he's talking about."
Yeah.
No crack of self-awareness.
So how do you develop self-awareness? And I can tell you how it began for me, but what about you? Have you always been self-aware, or was there a time in your life when you began to have self-awareness?
Yes.
What
It
happened?
was late 90s.
What brought it about? What were the elements of that experience?
Well, it started out with my just recognizing the weight of my upbringing and my schooling, and how it was all driving me in a direction that wasn't ultimately what, going to make me happy. It wasn't what I wanted. And I was just trying to be the best at it. But I started to realize, like, this is not going in the right direction. And I don't know anything else. Right. And then I met someone who said, "I get it. You don't have an alternative. You haven't experienced anything else." And that got me curious then. Like, oh, well, what would it be to experience something else? And in rapid succession, like God planned it, I met the right people to be introduced to the Landmark Forum. And then those people introduced me to my spiritual teacher, and poof, it all unfolded.
Your perfect path. Yes. By the way, I think that we all do have our own perfect path, and we just have to discover it for ourselves. So someone listening to the description of your description of how you began to access self-awareness, I listen to that and say, well, that's not for me.
Of course.
I'm not landmark education.
No. I get it.
And I'm not going to do that spiritual path.
Well, and I know people who are much more enlightened than I am that didn't have that path.
Yeah. Everybody's path is unique, I believe. And it's also, dare I say, divine. You said it's like God laid it out. I don't trust myself enough to understand what that means, what it even means that God would do that. But I believe it's absolutely possible. It feels divine to me. It feels like there's divine guidance somehow. I don't know how or why that happens, but it seems to, that at just the perfectly right time, I personally was desperate enough to be willing to drive across the state and go sit in a church. I hated churches. And listen to this crazy lady who had this amazing experience, she claimed, I didn't believe it, where she went to sleep one night as a workaholic, alcoholic, crazy, raging woman, and woke up the next morning completely at peace and disconnected from any meaning-making thoughts. Freedom. She was completely enlightened the next morning. She doesn't say it that way, but that's what she's describing. Then over the course of several years, developed a process that helps other people without having to go to the extreme lengths that she did, or have that kind of experience, to gradually become more enlightened, become more self-aware. and she called it The Work, and it's Byron Katie.
Mhm.
So that was the introduction for me. And I resisted it. It was a 4-hour experience that I had over there. I resisted 3.5 hours of it. And then finally something caught for me. Oh, this makes sense.
Mhm.
And I didn't notice it at the time, but the focus was inside for the first time.
Yeah.
And
Yep. Exactly.
I've been, I would have to say, an internal focus addict, a self-awareness addict ever since.
Yeah. Same here.
The nature of my
My friend Mike, he calls it. He says you're a transformation junkie.
yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's fun. Yeah. So I think we've really named something important here, that to be self-led, whether you're aware of and interested in the internal family systems model or not, what we mean by self-led is to be guided from the inside out by the essence and core of yourself, and to know and recognize that as these higher qualities, and as a sense of being far more resourced than the state of survival and competition, and resentment and suffering. And so what we've named here is to begin to get on that journey. Yours will be unique, but what we all will have in common is that it'll be a switch from focusing externally, which of course we're going to do because we have to survive, to beginning to look inside and getting curious about what's going on in there. So a switch to some way to switch to self-awareness, whatever that looks like for you.
Yeah. And it's in that I say things like it was divinely guided because self was leading. I wasn't leading. I wasn't aware yet. Self was leading.
The I that thought it was you wasn't leading.
Exactly.
Right. And maybe it's that very same I that became self-led and realized that who it thought it was is not who you are at all.
Well, there is something like there's some continuity. It's not like I didn't recognize myself anymore. Like it was still me, right?
Yeah.
So something was continuous and contiguous too, as the same body as well. So yeah.
I love this conversation. As usual, didn't know it was going to land here. Oh, one more thing I wanted to say. We said this. You said this. I guess we said it. We combined our thoughts together to say this before we hit record. Earlier, you said you were just doing your best. Late 90s, you were just doing your best. And earlier, when you used that same phrase, I said there's a big difference between doing your best and being your best. And because doing your best implies effort, and there's also another element of being self-led. I like the term, by the way, self-energized. There's a difference between there's an element of being self-energized that is just being your best without all the effort. To be our best doesn't require effort. In fact, effort might prevent us from being our best because we're too busy doing our best.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all of those people that we mentioned and more, who we would say with consistently self-led lives, none of them complain about the effort that life takes. They're all in a very easeful place about everything that gets presented to them. It's easy, or not easy, but easeful.
Yeah, they're easeful. Yeah. All right, Marty, need to wrap it up and get ready for my men's group here.
Okay. Sorry to see you go, but have fun with that too.
Oh, I will, guaranteed. All right, take care.
Bye.
We appreciate who you are, that you would be listening to this podcast, and want to acknowledge all those parts of you that yearn for the experience of the true you.
If you like this episode, click like, share it with others, and be sure to subscribe. Listen again next week for the newest episode.
Check show notes for a transcript and a link to resources, including a link to let us know if you'd like to be a guest on our podcast.
Thank you for listening and going on this journey with us back to the true you.